Welcome everybody to the NonProfit Alliance and our keynote speaker for today. Thank you for coming along online. We have a good audience here today in the background. And despite the title on the page, I'm not Carmel Malloy, as some of you may have guessed, Gavin Coopey, here today to introduce our afternoon session with Kylie. Before we start, I'd just like to recognise the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. Always important to do when we also have a virtual audience. And please, if you want to acknowledge your traditional owners, do so in the chat. We're on the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their leaders past and present. And also recognising in this year, importantly, that sovereignty has never been ceded. And coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. Very important to know. We also pay our welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, brothers or sisters who are joining us today. So today we're talking about understanding and embracing the intersectionality in the workplace. Well, I'm not actually. Kylie is, Kylie Van Leeuwen, and we'll come on to Kylie in a minute and that session. But before we do, like to say welcome, as I've said, to all of you joining online. In the room, we have the MPA Leadership Hub members, the coaching chairs like myself, and special guests. So welcome, everybody. NonProfit Alliance, for those of you that don't know, is about catalysing the collective wisdom of leadership across the not-for-profit sector through our membership and our work, our keynotes, etc. We're really sharing leadership lessons which we can all use within our work to create greater impact as a sector. And we've got some quite exciting things on the agenda coming up as well. In June, as hubs, we're moving into having our being hosted by members of the hubs and getting to see some interesting hybrid office environments, which will be very nice. In July, more details to come soon, but we have a mental health workshop, a well-being and resilience workshop, which will be quite an interesting all-day experience looking at all of the aspects of that important area for all of us with our work at the moment. And in September, we'll be welcoming back Trudy McDonald, truly a leader in sort of leadership performance and high-performing leadership teams. And she's always a pleasure to have her along. Also in June, we are the presenting partners for the Not-for-Profit Leadership Awards with the Australian Scholarships Foundation. And it's going to be quite a nice evening. You can buy tickets to come along. It's going to be cocktails. There'll be a panel discussion about what makes good leadership and the Leadership Awards. So please do look at that. It's going to be a very enjoyable evening at Daltone House on Thursday, the 15th of June. And so to today. Kylie Van Leeuwen is an alumni of MPA, ex-member, and she's here to talk to us today and introduce how we can go through a more structured way to approach embracing intersectionality. Increasingly important for all of us to be making sure that we are making the most of the diverse workforces that we have and every aspect of that, as Kylie will go into talk about. And particularly it connects with what we learned about recently. I think with the stat that we were given last session about the fact that by 2025, 38% of the workforce is going to be Gen Z. And this is a group that is particularly exercised by whether they're working in a diverse environment and whether their voices are being heard, whether their voices are being involved. So, you know, it fits very well with a lot of things that we've been talking about to understand this area better. So who better to do that with than Kylie Van Leeuwen? So I will, with no further ado, hand over to you, Kylie.
Put my cup of tea down. Now, I'm mindful that I'm not great at technology, but I will just only press the buttons that I absolutely need to. I've got tons of notes here because there's actually lots of data and stats that I want to share with you, but I tend to get so into the presentation and explaining what we're going to be talking about that sometimes I do forget So my notes do keep me on track. So before we get started, just pray that this is working. Yay, there we go. I just wanted to do some very basic housekeeping. I wanted to welcome everybody here in person, but also online. And for those of you online that need to or would like to, please feel free to enable the closed captioning to make sure that this keynote is as inclusive as possible for you. Couple of things about myself, again, for people both here and online. My pronouns are her, she, and hers. And a description of myself for those who are joining us today that may be visually impaired. I am a Caucasian female with, I would say, shoulder length blonde hair, it's starting to grow, and brown eyes. So, here we go. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet this afternoon, the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and who have cared for this land since time immemorial, and commit ourselves to a future with reconciliation and renewal at its heart. And I would also like to extend a warm welcome and pay my respects to any First Nations people joining us here today in North Sydney, but also those of you online. So I was saying to Carmel before when I first arrived, usually people wonder, why am I sitting and hearing this woman speaking to me today? What brings us all here together today? And so I'd like to just do a really quick intro about myself and Elevated Coaching and Consulting, just to, I guess, set the scene about who we are and why we do the work that we do. So Elevated Coaching and Consulting is a boutique coaching and consulting firm, and it was founded 2 years ago out of my passion to support businesses and individuals to reach their full potential and to thrive, essentially. We deliver specialist consulting, training and business solutions across Australia and the US. And I have over 14 years of experience in the nonprofit sector in leadership and coaching, leadership coaching and consulting actually, but specialising really in employment services, human resources, workforce development and designing inclusive social impact programs. A part of our purpose is to support leaders, teams and organisations to embrace diversity, equity, inclusion, understand intersectionality. We work to achieve workplace psychological safety, improve emotional intelligence in leadership, and develop an awareness of the importance of intersectionality in person-centred or human services, program design and delivery. We work with public, private and non-profit leaders to maximise social impact, achieve business sustainability and support companies to do well by doing good. We partner with non-profits to support their business sustainability, people and culture functions and capability to achieve greater social impact. So essentially, our purpose is to support every single person to reach their full potential. Now, for those of you joining us online, but also those of you in the room that may be visually impaired, I will be, again, to try and make this keynote as inclusive as possible, I will describe the slides, the infographics. I love an infographic. On each slide, just so that everybody's included and knows what we're moving through. So this first slide is actually, I love this infographic. It's essentially a picture of a human head on the side, and it's got a whole bunch of different faces and different photos of people from different backgrounds, just to represent what we'll be talking about today. So as we continue to work towards more diverse and inclusive workplaces and communities, it's absolutely essential that as leaders, we understand the concept and the importance of intersectionality. And today, for the next 45 minutes or however long I've got you for, I'd like you to think about these following questions. So are you fostering a truly inclusive and psychologically safe work environment where your team members can be themselves, thrive, and feel a sense of belonging? That's question one. Question two, how do you currently lead, engage, and communicate with your teams? And are your team aware of the importance of embracing intersectionality in the workplace, but also in how you design and deliver person-centred services for your clients? They're pretty big questions. And there won't be a quiz at the end, I promise. And so what we're going to cover today, just a little bit about what we're going to cover today, is the definition, firstly, of diversity, equity, inclusion, psychological safety, and intersectionality. And I guess what I'll be doing is really demonstrating how it's all interlinked. The common challenges and barriers to achieving workplace diversity and inclusion, best practices for fostering and sustaining workplace diversity, inclusion, and psychological safety, and why it's really crucial for everyone. And also the role of understanding intersectionality when we're looking at the whole person, both staff, but also clients or participants. And then finally, understanding why intersectionality is critical in workplace inclusion and psychological safety and in human services design and delivery. I promise we won't be here for hours. I can talk really, really fast. So some of you may know what diversity, equity, inclusion is, but those of you who don't, we'll give a really quick overview. DEI in a nutshell, I call it. So companies with more inclusive business cultures and policies see a 59% increase in innovation and 37% better assessment of consumer interest and demand. So when you think about it from purely a business perspective, diversity, equity, inclusion, and psychological safety, it makes great business sense. I don't know why we're all not doing it. And so when we think about these three interlinking parts of what make up DEI, diversity can best be described as, as all the ways in which people differ. And I'll talk about why that's not my definition of diversity in a moment. But there's a tendency to refer to people or a person as diverse. Even with the best intentions, referring to people this way feels a lot like euphemism, for outside the majority or different from the dominant group. So essentially it's quite exclusive. It's excluding people. This framing of diversity is actually misleading at best because it assumes we're all the same. At worst, it's a damaging oversimplification that alienates people rather than include them. And it's a problem we've seen echoed among job seekers, HR practitioners, and talent acquisition specialists. Some groups perceived so-called workplace diversity as a combination of many different backgrounds. At the same time, others view diversity more through the lens of equal and fair representation. It's important to remember that diversity is less about what makes people different, so their race, socioeconomic status, gender, and more about understanding, accepting, and valuing those differences, which is my definition of diversity. Then if we move on to equity, whereas diversity refers to all the many ways in which people differ, equity is about creating fair access, opportunity, and advancement for all. And it's about creating what we call a fair playing field. Successful equity initiatives must build fairness and equal treatment into the very fabric or DNA of an organisation. And this requires a design for creating, maintaining, and protecting equity organisation-wide, and a framework that supports equitable talent screening, hiring, workplace standards, and so on. So there's lots to it, which is why I'm sort of breaking it down, and then we'll link it all up in the end. And then finally, there's inclusion. So there's a common misconception that environments in which diversity and equity are priorities naturally result in inclusion. And I'm sure all of you have experienced this like I have, that you can have a very diverse workplace and inclusion actually is absent. And in my opinion, it creates often trauma, exclusion, and it's worse than having diversity in the workplace at all. And so you've built equitable practices into your organisational processes, after all, and so inclusion should come naturally, right? But that's not what happens. Inclusion is the extent to which various team members, employees, and other people feel a sense of belonging and value within a given organisational setting. So the important distinction here is that even amongst the most diverse teams, there's not always a feeling of inclusion. Women, for example, might be well represented at the senior management level, but still not feel included due to long-standing gender norms, salary discrepancies, and other factors. See, I told you. Let me see. There we go. Stick with me, folks. So some considerations when we're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, or I usually, with the clients that I work with in the space, use this as a guide, some steps to change when you're considering how you can implement diversity, equity, inclusion into your workplace. And so for those of you joining us, on the screen, we've now got a very colourful round of circular infographic. My descriptions are terrible, I know. And I'll go clockwise. So at the very top, we have awareness. And so where and how do I need to go beyond the surface to discover deeper truths? These are questions as leaders that we can ask ourselves. Diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts cannot just be full of intellectual pursuits and business cases. It's not just about setting representative demographic, targets, or starting a mentoring program. So that tokenistic thing that we see often in the workplace. Leaders need to feel it. They need to feel what their people in their organisation feel with as much empathy as possible. Before action, this is where we usually start. So we start at the awareness stage because we don't know what we don't know. And so building awareness and asking ourselves as leaders and leaders of organisations these questions will guide us on this journey to better diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace. So it starts with awareness. And then if we go clockwise, the next one is acknowledgement. So what truths am I proud of? So what are we doing well and acknowledging that? What challenges must I candidly acknowledge? So being really honest with ourselves as leaders around where is there room for improvement here? The next one is aspiration. So what do I, as the leader, aspire to be? What direction are we moving in as an organisation? And do I have the courage and the team and the conviction to make it happen? When leaders become more aware of the concerns of employees, particularly those that are underrepresented, and acknowledge and candidly acknowledge how leaders have contributed to or caused these challenges, there's a potential for real significant change. So it's all about being honest with ourselves. Without awareness and acknowledgement, which is those first two steps, it's all just lip service. And these types of DEI, we call it DEI, efforts can be more harmful than helpful, resulting in check the box activities and that tokenistic stuff that I absolutely hate, that reinforce the views of many employees that leaders just, quote unquote, don't get it. And so likewise, without a courageous aspiration, without a clear ambition of what will be different, leaders aren't ready for action. And that's the next stage. Action. So what will I do persistently and consistently to drive meaningful change? So it's not just a one-off exercise. We can move on and it all falls into place. It's something we have to work really hard at. An aspiration should inspire and make it abundantly clear that the organisation is serious about affecting real change. And that's when we get to take our people on that lovely journey with us. The last cog on the little wheel here is accomplishment. So in what tangible ways am I making progress and demonstrating growth? And then how are we communicating that growth outward to our teams? Okay. So now we've moved on to a slide called creating an inclusive workplace. So we're getting there. I'm hoping that I'm taking you on this journey. So you're seeing how it's all linked together. But just an explanation about the infographic that's on this slide. It's the canary code for building a more inclusive workplace. And again, I'll go clockwise. So on the right-hand side, we have removing success barriers. And on the left-hand side, we have removing access barriers, which is in the green for those of you that can see this slide. And so starting at the very top, we've got training in multiple modalities, intersectional inclusion training. So quite often I work with leaders, CEOs and leadership teams, and they say, well, we don't understand why our DEI efforts are sort of failing or not working or just not going in the direction that we'd hope. You know, we've put the team through disability awareness training. It's like, okay, what else is there? And so really working with them around, you know, that people living with a disability often also come from different cultural backgrounds, right? And so engaging them in a conversation around intersectionality. So it's not just ticking a box and doing some cultural competence, cultural awareness, or disability awareness training. It's looking at what makes up a whole individual and a whole person. And so that's what we mean when we talk about intersectional inclusion training. And so one thing I'd like to say before I go through this slide, this little circle here, is that excluding environments are actually created by us. And so if we can create exclusion, we can also create inclusive environments. So the next one there, if we're moving clockwise again, it's health, supportive, physical work environments. Then we have flexible work, so where, when, how, so that job crafting. And we do see that done quite well here in Australia and also internationally for sometimes people living with disability or other people with barriers to work. We then have civility and anti-bullying mechanisms. So we'll get into where this is leading in a moment when it comes to not just intersectionality, but also the psychological safety we're trying to create in our workplaces and why it's critical. Then we have fair outcomes-based performance measurement. And so that's really plays into that equity piece, making sure that everybody is playing on a fair playing field. Everybody has access to career opportunities, progression, but also things like professional development. So that's why often you'll hear diversity, equity, access, inclusion, workplace belonging, and psychological safety. So we're adding bits as we go because it's all interlinked and just as important as each other. And then we have fair, de-biased, transparent promotion. And I'm sure most people in this room and online have experienced unfair promotion previously. I certainly have. Then we have the last of those orange circles on the removing success barriers side of things is representation in leadership and decision-making. So not just diversity when we think about the teams doing the work, the soldiers, if we like, but also having that diversity of representation at the leadership level and the board level as well. And so now we're moving to the left and we're talking about removing access barriers here. So the first one here is realistic job descriptions based on job analysis. So what are people really going to be doing in their jobs? And is their job description a good indicator of what duties, functions, and roles they're going to be undertaking as part of that? The other big one, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, is inclusive recruitment. Then we have valid outcomes-focused selection process, making sure, again, that on your recruitment, part of your recruitment and your panels, when you're recruiting, that you have diversity in that group as well. And usually definitely more than one or two people. Then we have, where did I lose my spot? Valid outcomes focused selection process. Excellent. Then we've got fair compensation, which is avoiding those pay gaps. I think globally, women, we're battling for that constantly. And also viable part-time options to work. So making work more accessible for people living with a disability, but also people who may be parents or primary carer parents and have caring duties. And then the last one there, we have benefit options for different needs, family status, etc. In the middle, we have the Canary Code principles. So we have listed there participation, outcome focus, flexibility, organisational justice, transparency, and valid measurement. So when we're talking about creating an inclusive workplace, some of the strategies for doing that, because I know you're all here going, yes, but how do we do it? Some of the strategies to do that, to implement that, is things like providing opportunities for language, cultural competence and awareness training and support, which is what I just talked about before, incorporating diverse perspectives and experience in decision-making, and also problem-solving processes, ensuring equal access to professional development and career progression or advancement opportunities, recognising and addressing microaggressions. This is such a big one because the name suggests everything. They're microaggressions. They're often very subtle, but very damaging. So recognising and addressing microaggressions and discrimination in the workplace, and as leaders, walking the talk when it comes to that. really setting very clear boundaries and expectations about what absolutely will not be tolerated when it comes to discrimination in the workplace. And that could be gender discrimination, racial discrimination, and everything in between. Can tell that I'm a HR practitioner. Creating a culture of respect, trust, and inclusivity through clear communication, active listening, and empathy. Okay, and so it starts with all of us. This next slide, I was at home thinking, how do I describe this infographic? And it essentially looks like two things, either the number 8 turned on its side, having a little nap, or the symbol for infinity. So whichever one resonates with you, that's what we're looking at the moment. And so it starts with all of us. It's the board and CEO. It needs to be led from the front and led by example. All the senior leaders, all of the HR department, all the managers, but also all the employees needs to come on this journey. And then we're thinking about the implementation or the how part of it. The things that we've got on the right-hand side in this infographic are things like company brand, workplace culture, organizational processes, technological tools, compensation and benefits, and working facilities. So this is why I need my notes, because there's a little bit of research I'm going to sort of share with you now. So one of the first things when we're creating an inclusive workplace is to look at how we build intersectionality into our recruitment strategy. And research shows the company with greater ethnic and racial diversity are 35% more likely to yield higher results and those that have gender diversity are 15% more likely to outperform the industry average. Diversity in the fullest sense must be a recruitment priority for the entire organisation, including the board of directors. The second thing here is providing internal feedback opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about psychological safety and how we create a safe space in the workplace for this to actually take place. But organisations need to build internal structures that encourage discussion and questioning regarding these critical issues. So people need to feel comfortable first being able to do that. We need to work hard as leaders to develop an internal culture that invites feedback and honest feedback. Even the most junior members in the team need to be encouraged to innovate and weigh in on organisational discussions, because we can't be just a little bit inclusive. Inclusive is entirely. The other part is leading with empathy. Leaders who demonstrate empathy and who consider the perspectives of others are more likely to make people feel safe and that their experiences have been taken into account. And the other part there is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, which I'm sure you're all masters at doing that as leaders. But personal reflection inevitably leads to growth, as well as causing some growing pains. And we all know that. And discomfort is not inherently a bad thing. Again, we all know that too, I'm hoping. It's an internal alarm that sounds in your brain telling you to pay closer attention to something. And so feeling uncomfortable can be a symptom of growth. We all know that. We usually feel that fear just as we're about to step out of our comfort zone. And so the last part here around the how is the design accountability. So designing accountability into your workplace and to your sector. An intersectional leader understands that they can create change by making sure that their governance policies align with their inclusion goals. So it's one thing to set a goal and then walk away from it, or it's a nice to have. We'd love to be more inclusive. We'd love to have a more diverse staff or workforce. But if we don't build it into our organisational goals, it's just a nice to have. It usually is a nice strategy. We put it in a drawer, close the drawer, and it collects dust at best. So don't assume a traditional organisational design is better, because you've got a blank canvas when it comes to this and just starting. So some of the barriers, because we've talked about some of the how and some of the strategies, but what are some of the barriers to actually achieving workplace inclusion success, if you like? So inclusion objectives aren't built into the organisation's business objectives. Like I just said, if it's not important to everyone, it's probably not going to happen, or it's not going to happen well. And what typically happens is when you create a diverse workforce, if inclusion isn't absolutely nailed, those people that may be underrepresented in the workforce or the workplace, your workplace, it can be quite a traumatizing experience for them. So listing inclusion as part of the values just isn't enough. It must be a business priority that's tied to business success measures. Of the other challenges in fostering inclusion, the lack of accountability among senior leaders and stakeholders for achieving inclusion objectives for the organisation is a critical problem. And it's assumed all the time, and I hear this often, that it's a HR problem. And it's not a HR problem to deal with. It's actually everybody's problem to deal with. In mitigation of this, inclusion objectives need to be cascaded from the organisation's objectives into the performance expectations and measures of success for senior stakeholders. But it should be cascaded all the way down to everybody so that it's very clear in your messaging that this is something that's really, really important and it's a priority for the organisation. So essentially, it's up to all of us to create spaces where individuals can express themselves and be their multifaceted selves and to support each other as we push for comprehensive change. So we all have a responsibility to create inclusion. And inclusion is essentially about creating environments where all people can thrive. And it's about, for me, it's about I always say, it's about treating people like human beings. It's about valuing and respecting the difference that we all bring. And forgetting the labels, that's something else that I say as well. So essentially, everybody wants to be seen and heard and valued. Okay, ready? Getting into intersectionality now, everybody. So just a quick description of this next slide. It's another one of those wonderful infographics that I found, which is a bunch of different faces and different people representing all different backgrounds, cultures, genders, everything. And so it's almost in a flower kind of shape, if you like. And then on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got an infographic that says a workplace culture that feels safe, fun, and productive for some team members may feel profoundly unsafe for others. Recognising that this is the case is an essential first step for any leader committed to building a psychologically safe culture for all. So the definition of intersectionality is that it acknowledges that individuals have multiple identities that intersect and interact with each other, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and socioeconomic status. And that's not all of them. That's just an example. Embracing intersectionality in the workplace means acknowledging the intersecting identities of your employees and their different experiences. Okay, because often we assume a lot. I've been guilty of that. You think that what you see is what you get. And that's actually not the case. So understanding how this impacts their work life and using these insights to create an inclusive work environment. Now I've got some more research to share with you. So intersectionality was actually originally coined by an amazing, if you've got YouTube or you're into YouTube, look this lady up. She's amazing. It was originally coined by a lady called Kimberly Crenshaw, an American lady, in 1989. Intersectionality has gained popularity and is often discussed as a theory, a methodology, a framework, or a lens. Many different definitions have been proposed, largely by academics. Everybody's going to have a little giggle here in a moment. Many different definitions have been proposed, largely by academics and policymakers, and rarely by those most negatively impacted by it. Not surprised at all. It recognises that people's lives are shaped by their identities, relationships, and social factors. These combine to create an intersecting forms of privilege and oppression, depending on a person's context and existing power structures such as patriarchy, ableism, colonialism, imperialism, homophobia, and racism. And it's important to remember the transformative potential of intersectionality, which extends beyond merely a focus on the impact of intersecting identities. In essence, however, intersectionality is a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. It's a lot to take in. I read that 3 times when I was writing this. And so just as an example to demonstrate intersectionality, I'll use myself as an example. So what my identities are, and it might spark some conversation later. So my identities are, I identify as a mother, a cis female. I am the primary carer of a person living with a disability. And I am a childhood trauma survivor. And so if you think about all of those things, and there's loads more, but those are my primary identities. Would you know that by looking at me? What would you have assumed by looking at me? Probably that I was female, or that I identified as female. And so I guess that this is just to demonstrate that we do make a lot of assumptions, okay, in our communities, when we're working with clients and participants, but also very much so with our staff and our colleagues as well. And so what are the potential barriers or discrimination that I might face in the workplace? And so for me, some of my experience has been being a woman in the workplace and gender discrimination, missing out on promotions because of my gender, but also hilariously the lipstick colour and shoe colour that I wear. I actually had that said to me, and also my hair colour. I had a gentleman once say to me, if you want to be taken seriously, Carla, you might want to consider changing your hair colour. Carmel's like, what? She wasn't really. But so some of my experiences have been as a woman, as a working mother, and a single mother at times as well. And now as a woman in leadership and in business. And so if you think about even just now what your identities would be, and some of the assumptions that maybe you make in the workplace about your staff. So that was just me trying to demonstrate what intersectionality looks like for people. And I'll get into it in a little moment when we talk about intersectionality in the workplace. But the reason that's so important to think about this is because when we're communicating and engaging with our teams, not only the modes of communication, but some of the greetings that we might use without even thinking about it. We might jump on a Zoom and say, with a group of female or people that we believe identify as female in a meeting, and we might say, oh, good morning, ladies. But what we might not realise is that some of our colleagues actually might not identify as female. They might identify as non-binary. And so in that instant with that greeting, we're not making those colleagues or team members feel welcome, included, and like they belong. So that's another example. So the next slide is intersectionality in the workplace. So it's a continuation. And now the infographic we've got is we have intersectionality in the middle circle, and around it we have different coloured circles that have race and ethnicity, class, nationality, sexual orientation, gender, and abilities. And again, this is not exhaustive. This is just an example. And so there's a poet called Audre Lorde, some of you might know her, who said there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. I love that because it's absolutely true. And who we are in the workplace is who we are. We might not show all of ourselves at work, but we are one human being, I often say to people. So we can't split Kylie, the professional, or Kylie in the workplace or in the business, and Kylie, the wife, mother, and carer. We're one human being. So it's not simply that there's a race problem, a gender problem, or a class problem. Many times, traditional diversity and inclusion frameworks erase what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. And some of you in the room, I'm sure, design, develop, and facilitate or deliver social impact or person-centered programs as part of your organisations. And so I'm hoping that you're listening to this thinking, are we including everyone in how we support people? And so some of the solutions when it comes to considering intersectionality in the workplace involve building it into, like I said before, our recruitment strategies, making sure people have opportunities to discuss issues, and we'll get to that when we talk about psychological safety, and adopting an open and empathetic style of leadership. So we don't want to make assumptions. And we need to focus, like I was just saying, on the entire person and forget the labels. Because often the single label that we assign has been assigned by some other person. So company diversity inclusion programs that don't take intersectionality into consideration risk overlooking things like, well, overlooking experiences, but they will usually experience the inability to retain talent and to retain that diverse workforce that they work so hard to onboard and attract. Also, the inability to attract diverse talent again, because we all know that when staff have a poor experience, they talk about it. And if you're looking to be an employer of choice, this is something to really think about. Also, greater wage inequality, lack of professional development opportunities, hiring discrimination and inequalities in employment and unemployment, increased harassment and discrimination, workplace psychological trauma or injury, which often leads to workers' compensation. And that's something else that Elevated works heavily in that space. Unfortunately, I wish we had no work in that space. We are so busy in that space for people that are treated unfairly and discriminated against in the workplace. And also a lack of representation when designing and delivering your programs. So you might be losing the very people that may be able to give that innovative insight into how you design programs for intersecting identities. The last one, which we all know is a problem globally, is higher staff turnover rates. We can't afford to lose talented people. And so it's bad news for employers, because employees who face discrimination linked to intersectionality or any discrimination are more likely to leave the organisation. Now, the next slide, we've got an infographic on the right-hand side, and this is really talking about intersectionality and human services. Sorry, let me start again. I need another coffee, I think. Intersectionality and human-centred design and delivery. So when we're thinking about the people we serve and support, how do we make sure that our programs, services and supports include everyone? And so on the right-hand side, we've got an infographic that's, I would say, we'll go around in a clockwise manner. And so starting with empathy, what I would usually do, what I always do when I'm designing programs is consider what the perspectives of the people that you're trying to support and serve, what are they? So sitting with those people, it's not just consulting. I hate that word. We consulted with people living with disability. It's actually co-creating these programs, co-designing, co-creating and consulting with people and taking on board what the perspectives of those involved are. The next one is defining. So can you clearly and concisely articulate the goal? Why are you building this program or this service? Who is it for? And then 3 is ideate. So how many wild ideas can you create to achieve the goal? 4, which is really important, the prototype. Can you build something quick to test a solution? So like a pilot program, test it before you release it to the masses. It gives you an opportunity then to refine it and figure out whether it's hit the mark, what needs to change and how it can be more impactful. And we've done that a lot in the last 2 years, is design programs and then think, okay, there's something missing there, or we need more of this particular component of the program. So let's sort of shift and change when we design and deliver the next iteration. 5 is test. So pilot, can you test it with the person who needs the solution and get their feedback? That's genuine co-creation and co-design, is not only sitting with people, understanding where they are and what they need, but then testing it and then refining it. And then iterate, how can you improve the design based on the feedback? And actually using feedback for what it's designed for, which is making improvements usually. And so we need to move away from addressing individual identities like race, gender, disability, etc., and instead consolidate diversity and inclusion intervention efforts with a focus on the needs of all people, all identities, and all intersectionalities. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the 8 inclusion needs of all people framework, and a brilliant Australian behavioural scientist, some of you may know her, Dr. Liz Wilson, She actually designed this framework, and it's something that I refer to, I would say, weekly in the work that I do. And it keeps you on track as far as how do we, because a lot of the questions I get, just to take a step back, is, but how do we include all people? When we've just talked about intersectionality, there's so much to digest there. How can we possibly include all people? And a lot of organizations and leaders kind of give up. And so this framework is actually something that I use regularly in my design work when I'm working with nonprofits in particular and designing programs, either for tender or for, whether they're investing their own funds into a program or service. And so we've got here 8 inclusion needs of all people. So the first one is access. So ensuring that all people can see and hear or understand via alternatives what's being communicated, and physically access or use what is being provided. The second one is space. So ensuring there is a space provided that allows all people to feel safe to do what they need to do. So that comes into that psychological safety. And it's up to leaders to really create that safe space. 3 is opportunity. So ensuring all people are provided opportunity to fulfill their potential. Representation is number 4. So ensuring all people can contribute and are equally heard and valued. 5 is allowance. So ensuring allowances are made without judgment to accommodate the specific needs of all people. 6 is language. And I always say language matters. What we say and how we say it in the workplace it's more important, I think, than people realize. So language matters. Ensuring the choice of words or language consider the specific needs of all people. 7 is an obvious one. It's respect. Ensuring the history, identity, and beliefs of all people are respectfully considered. And the final one is support, which is ensuring additional support is provided to enable all people to achieve desired outcomes. Okay, are we ready? Psychological safety. So on the screen, we've got a picture of a human head and 2 hands that are encasing, I guess you could say, a light bulb, which is representing psychological safety. Or it might be a light bulb moment for some people online or attending today, hopefully. So what is psychological safety? So Dr. Amy Edmondson, she was a Harvard Business School professor. She coined the term psychological safety, and she defines it as a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And I won't do that thing where we go, how many of you in the room have experienced that in your workplace? But I know a lot of people who are often scared to speak up in the workplace, fearful about the consequences or how it might be perceived or some of that adverse action that we see happening in the workplace. And so Edmondson pointed to psychological safety as a critical factor for high-performing teams. Most recently, Google's research on characteristics of high-performing teams identified psychological safety as their top indicator of the performance of a team. And it makes sense, right? Because when people feel safe, they relax. I know when I'm not either feeling safe, you feel quite tense and anxious, and I don't do my best work when I'm in that headspace. So when people feel psychologically safe, they not only feel like they belong, which is beautiful, but they also do their best work. They collaborate, they innovate, and so on. So teams with strong psychological safety are less afraid of the negative consequences that may result from taking smart risks, making mistakes, sharing their opinions with their team, being candid with one another, but also being candid with their manager or their supervisor. And because of this, these teams are more likely to share their opinions when they differ from one another. So it's okay not to agree. And avoiding that groupthink that we see quite often when there is, that absence of psychological safety. And they take initiative when it matters most. So the relationship between psychological safety and diversity, equity, inclusion, and intersectionality is that psychology, wow, I do need another coffee. Psychological safety is a key component of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So you can't have one without the other. Yeah, you can't have a psychologically safe workplace if there's no inclusion. It just doesn't happen. Diverse opinions, experience, and knowledge can be better leveraged if team members feel comfortable speaking up, they're not anxious, and they're accustomed to considering alternative viewpoints. So they become more open with each other, and they sort of develop that open mindset that we talk about all the time, that growth mindset. Highly inclusive teams are empowered to share their unique perspectives with each other and are better positioned to reap the benefits of having a diverse team. Now, there's an author called Timothy Clark, and he authored the book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. And it's coming up on an infographic shortly. But and I love his description of psychological safety. He describes it as an environment of rewarded vulnerability. And the 4 stages of psychological safety that he refers to are inclusion safety. So when teams and individuals are thinking and saying things like, I'm worthy, I belong, and I feel safe to be here. Learner safety, I'm growing and it's safe for me to be a learner and make mistakes, and I can ask questions and I can show up and I cannot have all the answers all the time. Contributor safety, so I'm making a difference somewhere where it's safe to contribute my ideas, my visions, hopes, dreams, and opinions. And then 4th, there is challenge safety, which is, I think, the real key part of psychological safety in the workplace, which is here it's safe for me to challenge the status quo and help to fix what's not working. So that essentially speaking up. Okay, next slide is the why behind psychological safety. Why do we want our workplaces to be psychologically safe? And so the infographic on this slide is 2, they're not circles, my descriptions are terrible. The one on the left is psychological danger. And again, it goes clockwise, and it demonstrates there, and I'll read them out, what psychological danger looks like and it feels like in the workplace. And then on the right-hand side, we've got psychological safety. So psychological danger is that fear of admitting mistakes. So that real anxiety-inducing fear when you step into the office or you jump on a Zoom meeting. It creates that culture of blaming others too. People are less likely to share different views. So you usually don't have a lot of contribution, participation, like that really lovely, authentic, honest contribution where you're having meetings. People will say a little bit and then shut up, essentially. And then you have that common knowledge effect. People just say things for the sake of saying things. Have you ever been on meetings like that? It's because people are scared. They're fearful. And essentially what that creates is that really toxic workplace culture that I'm sure most of you have experienced. That's when psychological danger is felt and experienced by people. Psychological safety, on the other hand, when that's present in a workplace, people are comfortable making mistakes. They learn from failure. They're not bothered by it as much. They feel safe enough to admit failure too, including leaders. Everyone openly shares their ideas. So you get that really awesome collaboration, and from collaboration, you usually see innovation as well. And then better innovation and decision-making. So some of the benefits and consequences are staff retention, less staff on leave. So usually when people are feeling psychologically unsafe, there's a lot of sick leave, right? Your retention rates are terrible. Staff health and wellbeing is probably the number 1 here for psychological safety. More innovative and collaborative, positive workplace culture, inclusion, which goes without saying, client and participant satisfaction and outcomes. So if you're operating in an environment where your staff are working with participants, clients to get outcomes for those people, if your staff are feeling psychologically unsafe, guaranteed they're not coming to work happy. And the client outcomes and the client experience really suffers. They can feel it. Also, psychologically safe teams are productive, much more productive and much more high performing. And the good thing for business is it has an impact on your bottom line. So psychologically safe teams usually, and organisations, the businesses, have a positive impact on their bottom line. Okay, so how? So we know the why. Why do we want to do it? But the how. So the work that we do with leaders and leadership teams is always talking about how we lead by example. So leading this change from the front and leading by example, and also promoting that self-awareness with our teams and our individuals that work for us. Adopting vulnerable, authentic leadership. So admitting mistakes and that we don't know everything just because we hold a particular position as a leader. Demonstrating concern for team members as people. Actively soliciting questions and feedback. Showing value and appreciation for ideas. So it opens the door for that feedback and for people to come to you with ideas. Owning up to our own mistakes as leaders as well. Explaining the reasons for change. And this is something I see all the time when we do change management, is leaders not communicating or explaining the reason for change well, and not using a whole diverse range of methods of communication to do so. Be precise with information, expectations, and commitments, and promote positive dialogue and discussion. Provide multiple ways for employees to share their thoughts. So not everybody wants to fill out a survey monkey all the time. Not everybody feels comfortable speaking up if they're introverted to give their feedback. So provide multiple ways for people to share their thoughts. And I think that was it. I went round and round and round. Yeah, I did. I covered them all. Excellent. But I guess at the end of the day, the big thing is creating that safe space for your staff and for your teams, but also for participants. And I had someone not long ago, a real senior leader, say to me, well, how do we create a safe space? And it's all of these things that we've been talking about today, that psychological safety. So what I was speaking about before, that author, these are the quadrants of psychological safety. And so on the slide, we have outcomes of workplace psychological safety, and we have 4 quadrants. So we had learner safety, we have collaborator safety, inclusion safety, and challenger safety, which are all those ones that I read out earlier. So the other really critical part is the inclusive leadership part. And so there's 7 traits of inclusive leaders. The first being cognizance. So we always say bias is a leader's Achilles heel. Curiosity. So different ideas and experience actually enable growth. Creating a safe environment. So building that rapport, building that trust and respect with your teams. The collaboration piece. So a diverse thinking team is greater than the sum of its parts. Courage. So discussing imperfections involves personal risk-taking, and also involves that vulnerable, authentic leadership as well. Cultural intelligence is huge. Understanding that not everyone sees the world through the same cultural lens. And commitment. Staying the course can be hard, and going the distance. So it's important to lead by example by asking for feedback, acknowledging mistakes, seeking different opinions, and being really approachable. Creating a safe environment by accepting ideas, being non-judgmental, and looking for innovative approaches. Developing an open mindset is also critical, and research demonstrates the importance of open mindsets in helping teams become comfortable with taking risks, continuous learning, and improvement and feedback. And I always say, learn the language of psychological safety and invite what we call airing and sharing. So that real open dialogue with your teams. I think we're coming to the end now, but on this almost last slide, it says on the screen here, psychological safety is not the absence of discomfort. It's being able to navigate discomfort in a different way. And the infographic here, we have psychological safety on one axis of this diagram. And then on the bottom, we have performance standards. And so if you have high psychological safety and high performance standards, you typically see your teams and yourself in the learning zone. So people collaborate and learn in the service of high performance, getting complex and innovative work done. If you have high performance standards but low psychological safety in the workplace, people usually sit in that anxiety zone that I was talking about before. It's full of fear. People are reluctant to offer ideas, try new things, or ask for help, putting the work at risk. Then if you have low performance standards and low psychological safety, you have people sitting in the apathy zone. So people show up at work with their hearts and minds elsewhere. They're kind of disengaged, maybe looking for another job, and choosing self-protection over exertion. So they're those staff members that often maybe fly under the radar and do that bare minimum to avoid a performance management conversation, right? We're all nodding our heads going, yes. We've all had those. And then finally, in the top left-hand corner, we have high psychological safety and low performance standards, and that's the comfort zone. So again, that those staff members that are, or people that are open and collegial but not challenged, again, doing the bare minimum. On teams, they fail to make major strides. They take a back seat. So we're coming to the end now. What will you do to create a more inclusive workplace? What are the intersectionalities, I guess, the intersecting identities that you have, but also your team members, your colleagues, your clients and your participants as well. And that is it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kylie. And I think I like the younger blonde version of me. Actually, I'll stick with that. For those of you who are at home, we will continue with a couple of questions in the room, because I'm sure there'll be a few people that want to ask something of Kylie. And if anyone on the Zoom wants to actually exit for other meetings, we understand. If you'd like to stay, we'll leave the meeting open in case you'd like to listen to the questions. And we'll be using a microphone in the room so that you can hear. So is there anybody on the floor that would like to ask Kylie a question based on the information overload we've just had?
Yes.
What's the take in?
I knew Mark would ask a question.
It's more a comment than a question. First of all, thank you, Kylie. That was great. Two things struck me with this is that I've had the privilege of working in disability for many years. And my pet hate is when you use the expression a disabled person. It's a person with a disability. And that brings in the intersectionality, this they are a person, and all of those things, culture, sexual orientation, all that type of thing comes through. So I think that's really fundamental to recognise this intersectionality, particularly in that disability space. The second comment I'd just like to make too is that within our hub, we've been doing a lot of work on high-performing teams and so on. And I suppose the foundation pillar of a good team is around trust. And you will not have that without that awareness of intersectional intersectionality, but also that psychological safety is fundamental to all of that. So I just want to say it resonated, and thank you very much. That was great. Very good. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, we could do a whole other session, I think, on disability employment services and disability supports in Australia. And it's often disability is the one identity that's left out of the conversation. And it's the one identity that experiences all of it, the sexism and the gender discrimination and the misogyny and all of it. So, yeah, we've got a way to go.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. Thank you for the presentation. Your quadrant before that you had around the different types of, you had sort of like apathy and anxiety. And those sorts of things. I'm wondering if you can provide any commentary on, in your experience, how long it takes to move someone from that place, perhaps of apathy, to, I guess, that top right-hand quadrant. And, you know, are there any differences in terms of moving people around between the quadrants, and things that as leaders we should keep in mind? You know, does it sort of, can you move linear, or does it sort of move in, I guess, a little bit of a different way in terms of moving them from, for example, apathy to anxiety to then going from there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other webinar, isn't it? But I think it's each individual's different, and we do lots of mindset coaching with leaders. And one of the things, and that's a common question, is I've got this staff member or this kind of cluster of staff members that's sitting here. How do I get them from here to here? And I think it's really about the mindset that each of those individuals is sitting in. So if they're in that fixed mindset and they're really closed off, you can still work with them and coach them, but it might take a longer period of time to take them on that journey to where you want them to be and where they probably want to be as well. Nobody wants to be negative, sort of resistor to change and under performance management and all those things. But I think it's definitely like an individual approach. But I would start having conversations about where they're sitting with their mindset, like maybe what's also going on for them personally. There might be things in the workplace that are triggering that person. I have seen that a lot when I was leading a team as part of as a leader in an organization. I did see that a lot. And it was only when that trust, rapport, respect and psychological safety was built that people started to go, I know you probably don't know this, and I didn't really want to share this, but my husband left me, or my wife's left me, or something's happened in my personal life. And so I think making sure we're creating that safe space for people to bring their whole self to work, and I hate saying that because it is a bit of a buzz term, but creating that safe space and having those conversations with people going, I'm not sure if you're aware, but your behavior is actually looking like this. We see, that there's so many strengths in you, and we know that you can do this over here, and we want to work with you to get over there, but like, I can't help you, and I can't want your success more than you. So I think it's really, getting into a coaching space and understanding maybe what else is happening with that person. And what might be happening in the workplace that's triggering them. If nothing's happening in the workplace to trigger them and they're just that person, which we've had those as well, it's having the conversation with them and making them aware of their behaviour. I have so many HR conversations with leaders, and they say to me, I'm having this issue with this staff member. And then when I meet with that staff member, often they're not even aware that their behaviour is that jarring. And so it's really just saying, well, this is what's happening. It's not meeting the expectations of the organisation and setting the expectations for their behaviour moving forward. And I always say, link it to your values when you're having those conversations. You're not walking the talk. You're not representing our values by the behaviour that we're seeing in you. So work with us and we can help move you into a much happier place.
I think that's great advice. Nobody wants to be in that zone. It's so true. But none of us want to be in that negative space. And sometimes we do get to label people, and we shouldn't. That's the person's the problem. And I think as leaders too, I heard something the other day. I was very lucky to actually hear Don Price speaking from Atlassian.
Oh, yeah.
And Don said it took a long time into his adult life to realise he needed to stop commenting and ask questions. So he said what he would do is he would hear something from a staff member and he'd be immediately in that won't work, or we've done, and he didn't realise his behaviour was actually, if he went from the negative thought to asking a question, that person felt heard. He learnt more about their perspective, and it was a win-win situation. So the moment you want to go no or give a counterpoint, ask a question instead. And he said it really takes practice to do it. But I thought, what a great suggestion. It's something so simple that can make people feel so psychologically safe to be able to speak up. It's a really good reminder, I thought, to just, and I know it would take practice. We all go to that zone, but we're just going blah, rather than stopping and asking that person what they think and what we might learn in the process. But Kylie, I think we might leave it there. Kylie's actually spending lunch with us, so the people who are lucky enough to be in the room, that we can continue the conversation over the meal, which has hopefully arrived outside those doors. But thank you again, Kylie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, people at home.
Bye, everyone.